All right, good morning everyone and welcome to the second quarterly webinar of the year. Today's topic is water quality and use for dairy production, and Dr. Paul Koninoff from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln will be giving today's presentation. And if you have any questions as we're moving along, feel free to type your questions in the chat.
Okay, so I appreciate the opportunity to present this webinar, and many of these slides I presented at the Large Herd Dairy Conference meeting, which was held in Illinois about a month ago. And so what I want to do is spend some time talking about water quality and use for dairy production. So before I do, I'm just going to talk about the objectives of my talk today, and what I've got them listed here below on the slide. But before I start, I just want to show you this picture of Anton Mauve. Anton Mauve was actually a Dutch realist painter in the late 1800s, and frequently the characters in his painting were Dutch peasants from the countryside working alongside their animals. And Kim just maybe send me an instant messenger saying you can hear me okay. But this is a picture entitled Changing Pastures, and I think it's very applicable also to how we in dairy production deal with water. You can probably read into a story into this picture of somebody and this lady or this Dutch peasant adapting to her surroundings, whether it's a change in the pasture, perhaps a change in the water supply. And in this case, it looks like the water supply is probably very ample. The skies are dreary, pastures are probably wet, and there's probably ample water. Nonetheless, this person is adapting to their surroundings. And this is very applicable and I think consistent with sorry, I'm just sending a message to make sure Kim can hear me. So what I'd like to do is talk generally about water and dairy production, and I'm going to talk about the prediction of free water intake. Why in the world are we interested in free water intake? Well, if we're balancing rations and trying to understand what minerals the animals are consuming both in our water and in our ration, we need to be able to predict free water intake. And then what is water quality, and what are some common challenges and guidelines? As far as the guidelines go, you should have available to you, I think it's available on the top right-hand side, something entitled Water Quality Table. That's just a very generic description of good quality water and some perhaps some levels where you may find some minerals or other constituents problematic. So I would refer you to that table and feel free to download that table. And if you have questions, feel free to contact either Kim or myself with some answers. So before we talk about water in the cow, I want to take some time to talk about water sources. And this is actually a map of the major aquifers found in the United States. And when I travel across the country and receive calls from around the country, you know, it's very interesting to hear the story of water quality of any particular farm. But often underlying those problems is actually problems or challenges as the source of water. And as you can see, there's a number of major aquifers in the United States, and these aquifers are important not only because they are a source of water, but each one is unique and supplying very unique water sources to the farms which they're found. And so if you look at different areas of the country where there's a lot of dairy cattle, you can see that the water that they're being supplied, just like the feed that they're being supplied, is very different, and that's largely based on the aquifers which that water is coming from. So in the state of Nebraska, anybody who's from Nebraska has probably heard the term the High Plains Aquifer. The High Plains Aquifer is a shallow water table located beneath the Great Plains. And I've got here just a graphical description of the High Plains Aquifer. It's interesting because that overlies approximately 112 million acres covering 8 states. And it represents 27% of the irrigated land in the United States. And also 30% of the U.S. groundwater, which is used for irrigation. We in Nebraska are very fortunate in that we overlie an area where we probably see the greatest amount or volume of water, as is illustrated in this figure. It does not come without responsibility, though. So one of the things that the state of Nebraska has been able to utilize and take care of is our state water supply, and that certainly has had some tremendous impacts in the state, not only in terms of economic value, but also on water quality itself. And this is just a figure showing the density of registered irrigated wells. And when I show this slide to people from other parts of the country, they're very surprised to see the high concentration of registered irrigation wells that we have in the state. Currently, there's approximately 100,000 registered wells, and the highest concentration is found along the Platte River, and that's been designated in this figure as points with that are actually red in color. So we have a high concentration of irrigation wells. That has impact on water quality and the impact on dairy cows as well, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Again, probably not a surprise to you that are from Nebraska, but this is a figure showing the top 5 states in total irrigation acres. Nebraska being 1, California coming in 2nd, Texas coming in 3rd. So what impact has this irrigation had on the High Plains Aquifer? It's been estimated that since pre-development, there's actually been an overall decline of 267 million acre feet in the High Plains Aquifer. So it's probably not a surprise to anybody on the call here today, but the reality is the high density of irrigation wells has resulted in a decline in water volumes in the High Plains Aquifer. In fact, very specifically, since 2011 to 2013, it was estimated that there was a reduction of 36 million acre feet. And you know, it's interesting to see as you go south on in the aquifer, you can see that the greatest declines is found south of Nebraska in states such as Kansas and then Texas. And interestingly, some areas where there's some fairly high concentration of dairy units as well. What kind of trends have we seen in groundwater stores in the whole United States? There's a hydrologist from the University of California, Irvine, which has used a satellite which is named GRACE, and he's actually used that satellite to track groundwater levels and freshwater storage across the country. And it's interesting that if you look at these 6 major regions, that for the most part there's actually been a reduction in groundwater stores. And you know, one area that has certainly hit the headlines is California. Not a major surprise that we're actually seeing, due to the drought there, a reduction. And Kim just mentioned she lost my audio. You can't hear me. Okay, she says you can hear me now, and I apologize for this hiccup. So California with the drought, I think this is probably even worse, but there's been a reduction in the Central Valley in California in groundwater stores. Additionally, in the Southern High Plains Aquifer, which is listed as number 2 in this map, again, a reduction in fresh water storage. Again, major areas of livestock production in areas where there's documented reduction in freshwater storage. In fact, if you look in across the country, the only area that has actually seen significant increases in groundwater stores is the upper Missouri Basin, or areas that actually cover North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska. This is also an interesting figure. There's been some work out of Europe that have actually estimated what they call a global footprint of food production as an estimate of liters per kilogram of product. And I think it's interesting to see how different food production systems utilize water. And certainly some of the lower concentrations needed, or the lower amounts of water produced to produce feed, has been sugar production and vegetable production or starch root production. On the other end of the spectrum is beef production, which is estimated to require the most amount of water per kilogram of product. Somewhere in the middle is actually milk production. So if you were to compare us to these other industries, we don't do that bad. What I should note is this use includes all water used to produce feed. So obviously it does include rainwater as well to produce that feed. In general, for all livestock, the total drinking water that an animal consumes is approximately 1% of the total water needed by those animals. It's been estimated that, and you saw that on the previous figure, that you need about 1,000 kilograms per 1 kilogram of milk, and that dairy farmers actually use in total about 190 liters of groundwater per cow each day. And this is some research that's come out of actually the University of Idaho. So if you wanted to know just in general how much groundwater is actually used in dairy production, it's been estimated, and this was actually studied in a number of dairies in Idaho, that it was 190 liters per mature cow. This obviously may vary depending upon the time of year and, of course, the production setup, whether it's a flush system as well. So dairy cows themselves are actually on the upper end of water consumption in terms of livestock. You recall, livestock require about 1% of the water needed for drinking, but dairy cows require a lot more. They consume about 100 liters, or about 10% of the total amount of water needed is through drinking. So they rely heavily on drinking water. There's a number of studies out there that have actually tracked water intake. Some of it can come from feed. This is some research out of Europe looking at the total kilograms of water that was consumed. Feed water accounts for about 13 kilograms, whereas free water intake approximately 60 kilograms. And in this case, these cows were producing about 28 kilograms of milk. So just in terms of predicting free water intake, we've recently done some research at the University of Nebraska trying to figure out how to predict free water intake. This is critically important when you're trying to troubleshoot problems in water intake, or perhaps even metabolic problems, and trying to just get an understanding of how much water cows are drinking, because if you know that, then you can have a good understanding of how much water, how much nutrients, if your water is high in some mineral, how the total amount of that mineral that cow is consuming through her water. Okay, as I mentioned, there's a number of equations out there. They may look at milk yield, the percent dry matter of the diet, temperature, body weight, percent concentrate. We've also in our research evaluated a number of these equations. And so I'm just going to go through. This is a data set that we use to evaluate. I'm not going to go through it. This is just a listing of the equations to predict free water intake. And so if you're interested in these equations, please send me an email. I'll be happy to give you a list of equations and perhaps even provide you some insight on which equation to use. But this is just listing all of the different equations which may use. One that's frequently used is this Murphy equation, which looks at dry matter intake, milk yield, sodium intake, and also minimum temperatures. And that's a fairly robust equation, and a lot of people have really found it useful in predicting free water intake. And this is something that the last NRC, which was published in 2001, recommends using to predict free water intake. Interestingly, in our analyses, this came in as a really good model in predicting water intake based on the studies that were out there. And this is a metric just basically on model fit. The lower the number, the better the model was at predicting free water intake with our data set. So I want to talk more specifically about water quality, and if you're dealing with these things on your farm, this is probably a segment of the presentation that you'll be interested in. The reality is we've had some major analytical advancements on water quality, trying to measure what's actually there. Technology has been tremendous for us to improve our analytical capabilities. The reality is there's still kind of a disconnect between understanding water intake, the constituents in water, and the effects on animal. And there just has not been near as much research looking at the animal effects compared to the analytical advancements. Nonetheless, there has been some, and I'll do my best to present that research, but also fill in the gaps where necessary. The other thing is it's important to understand that there's some differences in sensitivities across different species of animals. And so even though there may be some research on swine or horses, and we try to borrow some of that information and fill in the gaps for dairy cattle, it's important to understand that there are differences in sensitivity across species. There was an NRC publication outlining very recently in 2005 the mineral tolerance of animals. This publication also does a really nice job, a concise job of talking about some very specific minerals that are found in water. This is the table which I've all suggested anybody that's interested in water quality on the dairy farm download. Again, that should be available on the right-hand side as a downloadable file. It perhaps expresses some very general overviews, but what I've got a listing of some major constituents that you may find in water, and we've listed an average, what is an expected, and then what is also considered a point where you may have some possible problems or cautions. So this is probably something, once you get a water test, you may want to compare your numbers to what are listed here. And it's amazing as you study water, you know, there's certainly more to water than just hydrogen and oxygen. All of these constituents are commonly found in water. Okay, what is good water? I think before we understand what bad water is, we have to take some time to understand what good water is. And it may seem obvious, but we need to spend some time talking about that. Good water is clear and colorless. It's low in total solids. It contains no disease organisms or pesticides, contains no undesirable flavors or odor, and no objectionable gases. And, you know, areas of the country, you know, just as an example of water changing, you know, some areas which have been involved in or sit on top of some areas where there's been some fracking have seen increases in objectionable gases in their water. And so these things may change over time, and I'll talk a little bit more later, but I recommend that as you take a water sample that you retain those results and you look at it over time to see how your water changes, because any of these things may change not only over time but across season as well. When I gave the talk in Illinois, one of the questions I had was how frequently should I test my water? It's hard for me to give an exact answer depending on what your farm is challenged with, but I would recommend that once every 6 months you get a water test and use that, number one, to set a baseline, and then as you can see how things are changing over time on your farm. Because these things, they may change slightly, but they also may change abruptly. And the last thing you want to be doing is finding yourself in a situation where you've got a problem, you suspect all of a sudden that problem has arisen because of water, but you've got no background data to show where you were 6 months ago or 5 years ago. So I recommend getting a water sample once every 6 months. Well, we often test forages because they're a good indication of quality, and water testing is no different. Unfortunately, water is a little more straightforward. It's often usually just a pass or fail. Those animals are consuming it, certainly increasing forage quality. There's kind of a continuum in terms of NDF or lignification. The reality is the water is either good or bad for our dairy cows. Why test it? Number one, I said, usually around every 6 months. Number one, human safety. If humans are on your site consuming water, I certainly would say water should be tested for their purposes. Animal safety, the other thing. There can be dangerous constituents in those in that water, and so just for your animal safety, it's important to test water, as well as animal production. You may see reductions, gentle reductions in animal production based on water quality. And I've already mentioned the importance of establishing a baseline. Okay. One thing I want to impress upon the audience is water can actually be an important contributor of nutrients. We often think of water just containing oxygen and hydrogen. The reality is it can contain minerals that can actually supply nutrients to the animals. These nutrients are usually good, but sometimes they can be in excess. And so this is a good reason why I recommend that you predict water intake based on some water quality or some water quality tests. So in this case, this is some research actually out of California where they surveyed a total of 39 farms in the San Joaquin Valley, and they looked at the concentration of water of these minerals. And so the minerals are listed on the left-hand side here with the concentration of water here. What I've got here listed is the requirements as they've published them in this paper. And then on this final column, looking at the percent required by the supply of water. And so in the case of calcium, the percent that was actually coming from water, which was required, was around 5%. So it was fairly low. But I will tell you, there are cases where these numbers can be really high in terms of 30% or more. If you've got water that's perhaps high in calcium, even sodium can be a high number, and magnesium as well. And so these numbers, although in this case we're all fairly low, it's important to understand, depending on your water sample, they can be a significant source of nutrients. Well, so I want to take a little bit of time talking about water and DCAD. And we think about our DCAD program for our transition cows. The reality is that either anions or cations may influence the DCAD value. So water can actually contain high concentrations of sodium and calcium and lack countervalent ions, and that can actually influence our transition cow problem. So if you have a nutritionist that's balancing for DCAD, it's important to have a good understanding of where you are with your sodium and calcium, because this can have major impacts on the transition cow problems. So these problems certainly can arise where you have water that's high in sodium and calcium. The reality is more frequently what we see are high anions, which may also pull lactating cows out of their optimal DCAD range. So if you've got nutritionists looking at DCAD numbers, I highly recommend that they also get an estimate of these minerals in water and get an estimate of total water intake. There's a number of sources of water quality guidelines that are listed here. I'm not going to go into great detail. Some of these are from the United States. The EPA has some guidelines. They're obviously excellent guidelines. We have to keep in mind that those are for human consumption. And if you recall, I mentioned that different species may have different mineral tolerances. And so keep in mind the EPA are great guidelines, but they are related to humans with unique sensitivities. They also tend to be a little on the conservative side, if I may say so. So trying to transpose that to livestock, we have to be a little careful. There's also been some recent guidelines that have been updated both out of Canada as well as Australia and New Zealand. So you've already seen some information from the U.S. Geological Survey and some publications. They've done a tremendous job in mapping water quality as it changes by geography and geology in the United States. So I'm going to share some slides presenting that. They also presented a publication looking at trace elements and radon. So if you're interested in how water quality or trace elements may change across the United States based on geology, I'd recommend that you go to these publications, but I'll be presenting some information from these publications. So the first thing that we may look at when we're looking at water quality is total dissolved solids. This is probably the first thing that comes up on your water test. The other term you may see is the term salinity. This is used synonymously with TDS. TDS, or total dissolved solids, is just a very generic measure of inorganic constituents. But the reality is, the way they measure this is they just basically put a filter on and see how much material is retained on that filter. And their thought is that that's a good estimate of inorganic constituents. But you can have some organic compounds on that. And the other thing which that I've mentioned is that the nature of TDS, or what's retained on that filter or what's in that water sample, is obviously influenced by the local geology. What's actually in the total dissolved solids? Well, actually, there's a fairly short list of usual suspects. We've only got about 10 elements of water that make up 99% of the total dissolved solids. I've got those listed here. These 10 elements are really what's influencing the total dissolved solids. Okay. The other thing which is probably more important to understand is you've got these different elements, and they actually come in different forms. And so you have different ions or ionic compounds which are found in total dissolved solids. And I've got these listed here. Things like carbonate, bicarbonate, chloride, fluoride, sulfate, phosphate, nitrate are major ionic and ionic compounds that are actually found in that water. It's important to understand that TDS alone isn't enough to understand what water quality is. It would be nice if we could get this rapid test and get one number to give us an idea of water quality. The reality is it's probably a good pre-indicator. So if you see TDS being high, you probably have to ask yourself, well, what in that water is driving up a high TDS? Okay, so it's a good pre-indicator, but it isn't necessarily a full story in and of itself. This is just a map of the United States from the U.S. Geological Survey, looking at how TDS changes across the countryside. Probably not anything overly surprising here. You'll see in in the table that I've given as a handout, we kind of expect TDS being less than 500. If it's anything greater than 500, there's probably reason to start asking questions. You can see in the state of Nebraska, we have cases where TDS can be quite high. Other parts of the United States, certainly we can find high TDS. An area in Texas where they've got a lot of dairy cows, we find a high TDS. The other part is you see this area over here in Utah and Idaho. I have a colleague at Utah State University, and when he saw this map, he pulled me aside after the presentation and just said, just laughed. He said, "Paul, a lot of dairies that I work with are in areas of Utah and Idaho where we know TDS is high, and we see some tremendously challenging water tests from this area of the country." So another estimate you'll see on your water test is something called hardness. This is an estimate of dissolved minerals in water, or a total cationic effect of usually calcium and magnesium. However, there are a number of other minerals that can be included in this hardness, but the reality is we're usually looking at calcium and magnesium. So when somebody says, "I have hard water, is that a problem for my dairy cows?" Generally speaking, we don't believe that it has a negative effect on free water intake. So high hardness in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem. Where it comes into play in dairy production is it actually may affect the accumulation of scale, or that buildup you may see on water handling devices or water delivery devices. And this may affect the cleaning of milking equipment. So any time where you have a high bacterial count in your milk, it may be a result of high water hardness and scale, which is affecting the water flow through that system. So what do we expect? Usually we expect anything less than 180 milligrams per liter. But you can see many parts of the United States actually have concentrations of hardness much higher than 180 milligrams per liter. Okay, this is just reality when we look at water quality. I'm going to talk more specific about the constituents in here and where there may be a problem. So in terms of those constituents, I want to spend some time talking about a term called speciation. That's essentially a term used to describe the form of any given element in water, whether it's a hydrated ion, a molecule, or a complex ion, or a molecule itself. Okay, fresh water usually contains hydroxyl or carbonate complexes. And the reality is the reactivity and the toxicity of minerals is actually dependent upon these ionic forms. So this is why I say it's not enough just to look at the very specific mineral, but you actually have to look at what form that mineral is in your water to really understand the impact on the animal itself. So one thing that you'll hear a lot about in terms of water quality and dairy production is sulfate. And we usually see sulfate in the water coming from sulfate-bearing minerals in the local geology, which is found in the soil and rocks. But it's important to also note that sulfates can come from household or industrial contamination. And so if we see high sulfate in the water and you're not in a particularly rural area, you may actually be getting some sulfate from some contamination sources. We do know that high sulfate does negatively affect the intake of water, and the common forms of sulfate are calcium, iron, magnesium, manganese, and sodium salts. So high sulfates may negatively affect water, but the other thing is it may actually negatively affect the availability of a number of minerals which I've got listed here. One of the things that's common is that sulfates may, through the formation of thiomolybdenates, tie up copper. So this is stereotypically a concern that we have with high sulfate, is that copper is tied up. And so if you're in an area where you see high concentrations of sulfate in your water, I would highly recommend that you talk to your nutritionist and consider adjusting the ration, because those animals may not have these specific minerals as available as you would expect if sulfate was not in the water. What are some recommendations for sulfate? So if you're looking at a water test, what should you see? Well, if you're anything over 500 milligrams per liter, you probably have to look at the specific salt or sulfate that's there. As I've mentioned, high concentrations of sulfate can negatively affect water intake, okay? And so your water, when you're looking at both calves and adult cows, should not contain anything more than 500 milligrams per liter for young animals, and perhaps 1,000 milligrams per liter for adult cows. It's also been recommended that for beef cattle, based on the high grain diets, that they tend to be a little more susceptible to sulfate problems, that their water not be anything greater than 600 milligrams per liter. And as I mentioned, if you have high sulfate, you want to talk to your nutritionist about your trace mineral programs, and perhaps maybe feed some organic. I think organic is the correct form, or chelated form, to increase the absorption of a number of minerals, but copper is a big one you should be concerned about. Well, Dave Beatty from Michigan State has made some recommendations for fresh cows. I will say these are great recommendations, but they're really not well supported on research itself. But the recommendations he has is that anything greater than 1,000 milligrams per liter should invoke a fairly careful evaluation. Through his field experiences, he's seen that anything greater than 1,200 milligrams per liter may negatively affect milk yield, but may also result in fresh cow problems, specifically retained placentas and DAs. And so he's also got a thumbnail rule of sulfate plus chloride. If it's greater than 500 milligrams per liter, you may have problems with your fresh cows. This is I've looked at a U.S. map. It's not that insightful in terms of changing sulfate levels, but I do have this map of Texas. And you can see, again, areas of Texas that have high concentration of cows are usually found in places where there's high sulfate in water. The next thing, constituent I want to talk about in water is iron. That's a fairly easy thing to recognize. Some of you may know I grew up in Saskatchewan, and I still remember visiting some family friends in southern Saskatchewan and visiting their home and going out to their farm and seeing both their bathtubs, sinks, and water delivery devices just covered in red sediment, and that was because of the high iron. That's an easy thing to usually see, is you see the rust color, and it also contains a metallic taste. So if you're not accustomed to drinking high iron water, you'll probably immediately detect the high metallic taste. It's important to know that iron actually interacts with a number of minerals that I've got listed here, and as it does, it may actually cause nutritional deficiencies in these minerals. So again, if you have high iron in your water, I'd recommend you work here with your nutritionist to estimate total water production, to estimate the concentration of water, and to perhaps evaluate the supply of these different minerals. Okay, so a number of recommendations here, and some research out of Florida actually showing that high amounts of iron may negatively affect the absorption of copper. So these recommendations are not or are grounded in some really good research projects. So if you've got iron, consider looking at copper as well as some other minerals that I've got listed here. So as I mentioned, copper, zinc is another one. There's some really recent research out of, actually just came out several months ago out of Virginia Tech, looking at iron in the form of ferrous lactate, okay, and actually showing that this may cause oxidative stress in dairy cattle. And, well, what is oxidative stress? Certainly in terms of health and productivity, we're often worried about animals in the fresh cow or periparturient phase, and they may have compromised immune systems. And so we need to think about iron in water and perhaps some health issues that could cause these animals to be predisposed with some problems. And so some great research clearly showing that iron in water may actually cause oxidative stress in some animals. These are some general recommendations, is trying to keep iron below 500 parts per million, and to perhaps, if you've got high iron, to actually increase vitamin E in the diets. But you've got to be very careful on some of these recommendations. A caution level in water iron, I should mention this is ration iron concentration, but the caution level in water iron is probably found around 0.3 milligrams per liter, okay? So iron in the water certainly can cause some challenges for animals with compromised immune systems. What about iron in the water across different parts of the United States? Just going back to this slide, you can see a caution level of anything greater than 0.3 milligrams per liter. So you can see anything in red here would be of reason for concern here. So you can see that we in Nebraska are fairly fortunate. We don't have a lot of places where we see high iron, but you know, this is an area in Missouri and south where you can see, I can't imagine what it's like looking and drinking water in this area of the country with a lot of high iron. But there's a number of areas in the country that are challenged with high iron in their water. The next thing I want to talk about is nitrate levels. Nitrate can be present in drinking water. It may be a result of industrial pollution, but is usually, in terms of the agricultural setting, a result of heavy fertilization of the fields. It may also be a function of the shallow wells. So if there's fertilizing of the fields and you've got shallow wells, you're more likely to have higher nitrates in the water, okay? So certainly we need to be concerned about nitrate in the water. You can actually have an acute toxicosis where nitrate may actually directly be absorbed into the bloodstream, and this negatively affects the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood and may negatively affect the health of the animal, and it can actually be quite severe. And so this is the reason why we're interested in nitrate, is it when it gets into the blood may not carry as much oxygen, and those animals may actually die from nitrate poisoning. So this is something that we need to be very in tune with, okay? So in terms of dairy production, there's actually some good research out of Europe showing that changing the nitrate concentration in drinking water up to 180 milligrams in the milk, in the drinking water, didn't result in increases in concentrations of nitrate in the milk. So you can get some carryover of some nitrate in the milk, but in this case, fairly high concentrations of nitrate in the milk didn't result in cases for concern, high concentrations of nitrate in the water didn't cause for concerns in the milk. So that's some really good information to know in terms of of water and milk safety. Interestingly, this is a PhD thesis out of Iowa State University. They did observe, out of a total of looking at 128 Iowa dairy farms, that an elevation in nitrate concentration of drinking water was correlated with increasing calving intervals. So nitrate, high nitrate in the water may actually result in increasing the calving intervals or reproductive efficiencies in the dairy in your dairy herd. So this is something to be concerned about. If you're worried about nitrate levels, you may want to think that this is a problem in terms of reproduction as well. What about across the United States? Again, maybe not a surprising thing here, but you can see there are some areas of the country where some high concentrations of nitrate may be observed. This is an area of the country which I've spent a little bit of my professional life in the Chesapeake Basin. So areas where there's a lot of manure spreading on the field results in the high collection of nitrate downstream in the areas of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and this area of the countryside here. Well, what about Nebraska? This is something that in my early slides, I talked about irrigation being found in areas where there's fairly high concentrations of corn and probably fertilization. You can see in areas where there's high irrigation and probably high corn production, these are areas of the United States where we actually see some fairly high concentrations of nitrate in the water. So if you've got dairies located in areas listed here, you probably want to consider having a look at things and thinking about how your fields are being managed if you are the one spreading the fertilizer on those fields, and wondering what kind of impact you're having on your dairy herd. There's been some interesting research looking at uranium and how uranium levels in water may be changing. Okay, generally, most drinking water sources do have very low levels of uranium if they're shallow wells, so it's not a surprise. You may think that this should never show up in water. The reality is, known for a long time that we have some very low concentrations of uranium in our drinking water. We know this because uranium is naturally occurring, but we also know that we actually can have some contamination which could increase the concentrations of uranium in the water. So interestingly, nitrates and carbonates and iron and increasing pH may actually increase some biological activities in the aquifers. And so it's been thought that some of these factors that I've talked about before may actually be increasing the concentration of uranium in our water. The EPA has an estimate of water not being greater than 30 micrograms per liter for uranium. Again, this is a map of the state of Nebraska looking at the concentrations of nitrate and the concentrations of uranium in the drinking water. This hasn't been tested scientifically, so these are correlations. But in areas where we see high concentrations of nitrate, we're also seeing higher concentrations of uranium. And so the research which has been conducted suggests that there is a link between nitrate and uranium. So if you're in an area where you may see high nitrates, you're likely also going to see higher uranium in your water. The other thing that may show up in water is arsenic. Again, not a surprise. Arsenic is naturally occurring in the soils and minerals, and they alter the air and water and land from wind-blown dust, but also just through runoff and leaching. So the reality is we know arsenic is there. Unfortunately, arsenic cannot be destroyed by the environment. And we also know that arsenic is a human carcinogen, may cause some vascular diseases and some other health issues. So arsenic is something we need to be looking at in water, okay? There are a number of methods out there that can be utilized to remove arsenic in the water. I'm not going to go through in this presentation anything about removing arsenic, but just to let you know, there are a number of technologies out there that can do it. And we expect problems at anything greater than 0.2 milligrams per liter. Another interesting thing in terms of dairy production, you know, if we feed or if cows are getting arsenic in the water, there's some research that's been conducted actually at the University of Minnesota showing changes in the concentration of arsenic in water. For the most part, what the cow does is actually excretes that added arsenic through the urine and not the milk. So again, in terms of milk safety, arsenic in the water should not necessarily be the problem because the cows are getting rid of that arsenic through their urine. These are just some areas of the countryside where you may see problems. The EPA sets a minimum concentration of 0.1 milligrams per liter, whereas for livestock, the NRC has said it should be anything less than 0.2 milligrams per liter. So there are areas of the country where you actually see elevated concentrations of arsenic in the water. I want to spend some time talking about microbiology in water. You know, this is something that we're concerned about. Again, this is a challenging thing because probably the most important thing, you know, when you're dealing with any kind of microbial issue is to understand what microbe is there. So just like TDS is useful as a first screener, one of the things that we use in understanding water and microorganisms is something called fecal coliforms or thermotolerant coliforms. So again, that's kind of a first indicator, but what we really should be concerned about is what organism is there. Nonetheless, some regulations that have come out of New Zealand and Australia have made recommendations that water should not be greater than 100 fecal coliforms per 100 milliliters. So this is something that, again, will come in on your water test and will be useful comparing to. Okay. The other thing that's important in understanding rumen microbiology and water is something called biofilm formation. And so what we can actually get in terms of our water delivery devices is we can actually get something they call biofilm formation, which is when bacteria will actually start to coat along with minerals and other organic material, start to coat pipelines, and what you see is the formation of what they call these biofilms. And so this is very important when we think about water delivery devices. We often think about water quality and we want to look at the water tank, but we don't often think about what's residing in the pipes that are delivering water to those animals. This is some research, a paper out of Europe showing the formation of biofilm in some pipes that are responsible for water delivery on dairies. And you can see there's some very significant biofilm backup and some significant microbial basically existence within this biofilm in these pipes that are delivering water for dairy cattle. So we need to think about what's in these pipes. So really this is just the end of the presentation here, but I just want to spend some time maybe reviewing some of the conclusions. The first thing I want to say is if number one, get your water tested. My recommendations are to test it every 6 months, okay? And so as you're looking at your water quality numbers that are coming back from the lab, I suggest you go to the water quality table and compare those numbers to the recommendations in that table. Okay, we know that water will continue to challenge the global dairy industry, and this is just a reality as water continues to be more scarce, as our abilities to analyze it increase. We know that we'll continue to face some challenges in water quality. The issues related to both availability and quality are related to a number of very complex factors. And so it's hard just to look at one water quality test at a desk in some remote location and say what the problem is. And so if people are dealing with water quality issues, the recommendation is that they go out to the farm and assess the local and regional issues. And I talk to frequently nutritionists around the countryside about water quality. And many of these consultants will travel across the countryside, if not the world, and assess water quality issues. And my recommendation is that they go, if they're showing up in a new state or a state where they may only have one herd, to actually go to places like state or county extension offices to get an idea of what water quality issues are commonly found in that area. I think you'll get a very quick answer. People, that have been there for many, many years know what water quality issues are commonly found. And I think that'll fast track people that are coming in as consultants from outside the state to understand what those quality issues are. Issues that I didn't cover here, and I think this may be a good topics for future webinars, is number one, water treatment. There's a number of whole array of different avenues and methods that can be used to treat water. And for those of you that are dealing with it and that you're trying to engage private firms, I realize this can be a challenge. My recommendation is, if you are paying dollars to have your water treated to deal with some issues, that you have good numbers of water quality before any of this treatment occurs, and then to compare it to anything post-treatment. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to understand what you're dealing with before any kind of treatment issues to determine whether that treatment is effective. The other thing is, there's a lot of research out there just looking at water access in terms of height of water delivery devices, even the temperature of water, and where that's important in terms of encouraging free water intake. And again, this may be a good suggestion for future webinars. So these are areas which I have not covered but are obviously very important. So with that, I'll just leave a few pictures of my family enjoying some local groundwater or some local water stores in Nebraska and near the state of Nebraska in Wyoming. So this certainly is a resource that we need to understand what we have and is worth taking care of, not only for our animals but generations to come. So with that, that's the end of my formal presentation. I think any of you that may have questions related to water quality, feel free to send a message here, or even send me an email or give me a phone call. I'd be happy to troubleshoot any water quality issues that you may have.
Thanks, Paul. There are a couple questions in the chat, so I'm going to have you read the questions and answer them.
So there's a question: do we need to take all minerals in water in consideration when balancing rations? That's a good question. I would say, I would highly recommend, when you're balancing rations, you're obviously you should be looking at any mineral that's actually in your ration and be tracking that in the water as well. So obviously, as I went through the presentation, there's some minerals that are more likely to be problematic than others, but my recommendation is that of all the minerals you're tracking in your ration, you should also be tracking in the water as well. When we're looking at sulfate, copper is a frequent one. I would say most frequently we see copper issues with high concentrations of sulfate. So that's probably the big one. And then I would say any mineral that goes into your DCAD equations is something to be worth looking at as well. Look at, in terms of DCAD, we should be looking at potassium and sodium. Those go into the DCAD equation, as well as chloride and sulfur as well. These minerals can all have major effects on your DCAD program, and may be worth balancing the ration around if your ration is high in any of those minerals. So, as far as I know, I see these as the last questions. Kim, I'll just turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Paul. Thanks for joining us, and you can always visit dairy.unl.edu for additional webinars or information related to dairy.